The sound of laughter hit me harder than any slap ever could. I stood in the middle of my own baby shower, holding a pastel pink gift bag against my chest, as my sister-in-law's voice rang out across the room. "She's not even a real mom. It's an adoption." The words cut through the cheerful decorations and the smell of sweet frosting like a blade. For a moment, I froze, forcing a tight smile onto my face as heads turned and eyes quickly shifted away, pretending not to see the sting they all heard. Slowly, people began to drift away from me, their conversations bubbling back to life as if I were some awkward stain they didn't want to acknowledge. I could feel the space around me growing larger, colder, heavier, as if I was sinking into the floor. My heart pounded in my chest. This was supposed to be my day, the day we celebrated the family my husband Chris and I had fought so hard to build. Instead, I stood alone, surrounded by smiling banners and the soft clatter of champagne glasses, feeling like I didn't belong at my own celebration. And then, just when I thought I might break, the door creaked open. A man I had never seen before stepped inside, wearing a dark suit that didn't belong at a casual family gathering. His sharp gaze swept across the room until it landed on me. He cleared his throat and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm the judge who finalized the adoption." The room stilled. Even the air felt heavier. Then, turning to my sister-in-law with an unreadable look, he added, "And I'm here for you." In that instant, everything shifted. I always thought the hardest part of motherhood would be the waiting through endless paperwork, waiting for the phone call that would change everything, waiting to hold my daughter for the first time. But standing there at my own baby shower, surrounded by balloons, gifts, and people I once called family, I realized something far harder. Sometimes, it's not the wait that hurts. It's the way people look at you once the waiting is over. My name is Maris Holden. For most of my life, I had been the type to play it safe, the type who followed the rules, stayed polite, never made too much noise. I worked hard, loved harder, and believed that kindness would always be enough. When Chris and I decided to adopt after years of heartbreak, it wasn't a decision we made lightly. We sat through late-night conversations full of hopes and fears, held hands through home studies and interviews, and stared at the ceiling more nights than I could count, wondering if we would ever be enough for someone. The day we met our daughter, tiny, perfect, and fiercely alive, everything changed. She wasn't born from me, but she was made for me. Every smile, every soft sigh, every grip of her tiny hand around my finger was proof that love didn't need blood to be real. The baby shower was supposed to be a celebration of that love. I had spent weeks planning it, obsessing over tiny details like custom cookies and floral centerpieces. Chris's mother had offered her backyard for the event, and though there had been tension between me and some of the family, especially Lena, my sister-in-law, I naively believed that joy would eclipse any old grudges. The sun was shining that afternoon, warm and golden. The tables were draped in soft pastel colors. Gifts piled up around a chair marked "Mom-to-be," and every tiny onesie and handmade card seemed to hum with the promise of new beginnings. And for a little while, I let myself believe that everything would be okay. Family members trickled in, aunts with loud laughter, cousins balancing toddlers on their hips, neighbors carrying plates of homemade treats. Chris had been called into a last-minute work meeting, but he promised he'd arrive as soon as he could. As the yard filled, I tried to soak it all in. The tinkling of laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft music weaving through the air. I wanted to remember every detail, to tell my daughter someday how loved she was before she even understood the word. But underneath the smiles and congratulations, there was an undercurrent I couldn't ignore. Some hugs were stiff. Some smiles didn't reach the eyes. Some conversations stopped when I approached. And hovering at the center of it all was Lena, Chris's sister. Lena had always been a complicated presence in my life. Sharp-tongued, quick to criticize, but always in a way that was just subtle enough to make you doubt whether you were overreacting. She had 2 biological children and made no secret of how she viewed adoption. as a shortcut, a second best option, something less real. I had tried, for Chris's sake, to keep the peace, smiling at her backhanded compliments, laughing off her passive-aggressive remarks at family gatherings. But on that day, in front of everyone, Lena wasn't subtle. She was cruel, and no one, not one person, stood up to her. I could feel the warmth of the afternoon evaporating, replaced by a chill that sank deep into my bones. Still, I stood there, smiling tightly, clutching a gift bag like a lifeline, refusing to let them see how much it hurt. I told myself it didn't matter, that the only opinion that mattered was the tiny heartbeat waiting for me at home. But even the strongest walls have cracks. And as I stood there, feeling the space around me stretch and hollow out, I realized that love alone wasn't always enough to shield you from cruelty. Sometimes, it wasn't the strangers you had to fear. It was the people who smiled at you across holiday tables, who toasted your milestones with gritted teeth, who whispered just loud enough to be heard when they thought you wouldn't fight back. And standing there under a sky full of banners that read, "Welcome, baby," I made a silent promise to myself and to my daughter. I would fight back, not with anger, not with bitterness, but with a strength they had underestimated for far too long. And I wouldn't have to wait long for the opportunity. I tried to focus on the good things, the pink and gold balloons floating in the breeze, the tiny frosted cupcakes lined up on the dessert table, the pile of gifts that people had carefully picked out, or at least pretended to. I told myself to smile, to be grateful, but under my skin, something kept crawling. A feeling that the ground beneath this celebration was thinner than I wanted to believe. When it came time to open gifts, I took my seat in the mom-to-be chair, careful not to wrinkle the little sash someone had draped across me. People gathered around with their phones ready, their faces half-heartedly bright. I opened a few presents, a crocheted blanket, a stuffed giraffe. Each one brought polite clapping, quick flashes of cameras, and then hurried conversations returning to someone else's kids, someone else's pregnancy. Then came Lena. She sauntered forward with a large box wrapped in shimmering paper. Her smile was tight, her eyes gleaming with something colder than kindness. "Special gift for the mom," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I took the box, my hands trembling slightly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. I peeled away the paper slowly, revealing a baby book, the kind where you record milestones, first steps, first words. The cover read, "Our Journey from the Very Beginning." Inside, taped to the first page, was a note in Lena's handwriting. Well, sort of from the beginning. The room burst into laughter, not roaring, not out of control, but enough to feel like a slap across my face. I swallowed hard, blinking rapidly as my cheeks burned. I looked around, hoping for someone, anyone, to come to my defense. But no one moved. No one spoke. Even people I considered friends averted their eyes, finding sudden fascination in their cake plates and coffee cups. I set the book aside carefully, my hands trembling. Lena wasn't finished. She lifted her wine glass high, wobbling slightly as she stood. "Here's to the real moms," she said with a smirk. "The ones who actually gave birth." This time the laughter was louder. It filled the backyard, bouncing off the happy banners and pastel tablecloths like a cruel echo of everything I had feared. I sat, frozen, a smile plastered onto my face so tightly I thought it might crack. My heart pounded painfully against my ribs. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, louder than the clinking of glasses, louder than the snickering behind napkins. The worst part wasn't Lena's words. It was the silence from everyone else, the women who had sent cheerful RSVP notes, the aunts who had hugged me at the door, the cousins who had cooed over diaper cakes and pacifiers. All of them were silent now, silent and complicit. I wanted to stand, I wanted to scream, I wanted to gather my things, grab my daughter's framed picture from the gift table, and never look back. But I didn't. Something rooted me to that chair. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was sheer stubbornness. Maybe it was the image of my daughter one day asking me about her baby shower, about how we celebrated her arrival into our lives. I couldn't let this be the story. I couldn't let cruelty be louder than love. So I sat there, my hands folded tightly in my lap, and I waited. Waited for the moment that I didn't know was coming but somehow felt building, like a distant thunderstorm. And then, as if summoned by the storm in my chest, the front gate creaked open. A hush fell over the crowd. Everyone turned. A tall man in a dark suit entered the backyard. He looked out of place, too formal, too serious for a baby shower filled with pastel colors and fake smiles. He held a plain envelope in one hand and scanned the group slowly before his eyes landed on me. I recognized something in his expression. Respect, maybe. Or maybe just purpose. And in that frozen moment when nobody quite knew what was happening, a strange, fierce hope sparked inside my chest. Because somehow, I knew. This day, this awful, beautiful, gut-wrenching day, wasn't over yet. And the story I would someday tell my daughter was about to change forever. The man in the dark suit stood still at the edge of the backyard, holding that plain white envelope, like it weighed more than all the gifts stacked on the tables combined. The conversations died out. Laughter stopped mid-breath. Even Lena, who was still standing with her wine glass raised, faltered, lowering her arms slowly as her eyes narrowed at the stranger. No one moved. No one knew who he was, but we all felt it. The weight he carried into the yard wasn't just legal authority or formality. It was something heavier. It was truth. He stepped forward, walking with the slow, deliberate confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. His gaze swept the crowd one last time before settling fully, squarely, on me. "Are you Maris Holden?" he asked. My voice caught in my throat for a second. Then I nodded, my hands still resting in my lap, knuckles white from how tightly I gripped the fabric of my dress. "I'm Judge Raymond Burke," he said clearly, making sure everyone could hear. "I'm the judge who finalized the adoption of your daughter." A stunned silence followed. A few people gasped quietly. Someone dropped a plastic cup that bounced and rolled across the patio. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Lena shift uncomfortably, her smirk vanishing as she glanced at the crowd, no longer so sure of herself. The judge continued, his voice unwavering. "I came here today because I was asked to deliver something important," he said, raising the envelope slightly. "It was something I was happy to do, because too often people forget that family is not defined by blood. It's defined by love, commitment, and sacrifice." He crossed the space between us in a few long strides and handed me the envelope. "For you," he said. And for the first time all afternoon, a genuine smile touched the edges of my mouth. I took the envelope with shaking hands. It felt heavier than paper should feel. He nodded to me once, respectfully, before turning his gaze, sharp and unyielding, toward Lena. "And while I'm here," he said, his voice hardening, "I have another matter to address." Lena's face paled immediately. Her posture stiffened, her hand trembling so slightly it was almost imperceptible. Except that I was watching her now, really watching her. "Lena Holden," Judge Burke said, his voice cutting through the shocked silence like a blade. "You are currently under investigation for falsifying documents in a separate adoption application filed 2 years ago." Gasps echoed around the yard. I blinked, barely able to process what I was hearing. Lena, adoption fraud? The same woman who stood mocking me hours ago for adopting a child. Lena stammered, her voice high-pitched and panicked. "There must be some mistake. I don't know what you're talking about." The judge didn't flinch. "We have reason to believe that false information was submitted regarding your financial situation, living arrangements, and employment status," he said. "We will be following up." Lena stumbled back a step, her wine glass slipping from her fingers and shattering at her feet. The silence that followed wasn't just awkward. It was electric. It was shifting. I felt it happen. The collective realization, the unspoken apologies from every glance that had judged me, every smile that had been laced with pity. For the first time that day, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen. Judge Burke nodded to me again, then turned and walked back out the way he came, leaving behind a stunned, fractured crowd and a truth too heavy to ignore. I looked down at the envelope in my hands, tears threatening to spill from my eyes. But this time, they weren't tears of shame. They were tears of pride, of resilience, of fierce, burning love. I didn't need to open it right then. I already knew what it contained. Proof of my motherhood, proof of my daughter's place in my life, proof that love, real, stubborn, enduring love, had built this family. And no one, not Lena, not the whispers, not the laughter, could ever take that away from us. For the first time that day, I stood. I stood not because they deserved my words, but because I deserved to be seen. I held the envelope close to my heart and I smiled, truly smiled, for the first time all day. Because this was my daughter's story. This was our story, and it was just beginning. The backyard felt like a stage after the judge walked out, one where every actor had forgotten their lines. No one seemed to know what to do. Conversations that had buzzed earlier now died in unfinished sentences. Plates sat untouched, cake forks frozen mid-air. And there I stood, still holding the envelope against my heart, feeling the shift in the air like a thunderclap that had already struck. For a long moment, nobody approached me. Nobody even looked at me directly. The same people who had laughed along with Lena, who had quietly moved away from me after her cruel toast, now hovered in awkward groups, whispering in huddles too obvious to pretend otherwise. I watched them. I didn't move. I let the silence stretch. Let them sit in the discomfort they had so readily tried to place on me just minutes before. Lena was the only one who made a move. She stumbled forward, cheeks flushed, her voice low and frantic. "Maris, it's not what you think," she said, her words tumbling out too fast. It's complicated. I didn't mean—" I raised my hand, stopping her. For the first time since I had met her, Lena actually listened. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I said, my voice calm, steady. "Or you didn't mean to get caught?" She opened her mouth to answer, but closed it again when she realized there was no right thing she could say. Not anymore. Not after today. And I wasn't interested in her excuses, not for myself, not for my daughter. I turned away from her without another word and walked toward the center of the gathering, envelope still clutched in my hand like a banner of truth. Everyone's eyes followed me, hesitant, guilty, unsure. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to make a scene. I simply lifted the envelope slightly and said in a voice that carried across the yard, "I want to thank the people who showed up today to celebrate my daughter's life, not mock it." Some heads dropped. Some shifted uncomfortably. A few had the decency to look ashamed. "This isn't about how she came into our family," I continued. "It's about the fact that she is our family. And no amount of bloodlines, paperwork, or cruelty changes that." I looked directly at Lena when I said the next part. Real mothers show up. Real mothers fight for their children. Real mothers love. No conditions, no disclaimers. The weight of the words settled over the backyard like a fresh storm cloud, heavy and inescapable. For a second, no one moved. Then slowly, Chris's Aunt Marianne, a woman who had laughed earlier, stepped forward. She cleared her throat awkwardly and said, "Maurice, we're proud of you, truly." A few others nodded or murmured quiet agreements. Some simply looked at the ground, unwilling or unable to meet my eyes. I didn't need their validation. I didn't need their sudden shift in loyalty. But somewhere deep inside, a part of me, the part that had once ached for their approval, healed just a little. Chris arrived minutes later, breathless and confused, holding a wrapped gift and scanning the crowd. When he saw me, standing tall with the envelope in my hand and a quiet strength in my posture, he crossed the yard in 2 strides and pulled me into a hug. "What happened?" he whispered against my hair. "Everything we needed," I whispered back. He didn't ask for more details. He just tightened his arms around me like he already knew. Later that night, after we packed the gifts into the car and drove home, I sat on the couch and finally opened the envelope. Inside was a simple note from Judge Burke. "Family isn't defined by how it begins. It's defined by how it is lived. Congratulations, Maris and Chris. You are exactly the parents your daughter deserves." Tears blurred the words, but I let them come, because they were the right kind of tears, because they were no longer tears of loneliness or shame or doubt. They were tears of pride, love, and unshakable certainty. No one could ever again make me question my place in my daughter's life. No whispered cruelty, no backhanded toast, no thinly veiled smirk. I had fought too hard. I had loved too deeply, and now I had something no one could ever take away. The knowledge that I was her mother. Fully, completely, and proudly. The night after the baby's shower, the house was quiet except for the soft hum of the baby monitor in the corner. Chris had fallen asleep on the couch, still dressed in his button-down shirt, his arm draped protectively around a tiny pink onesie he had been too tired to fold. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold tea, the opened envelope from Judge Burke resting in front of me. I had read his note 3 times already, but I couldn't help myself. My fingers brushed over the ink again, as if the words would sink deeper into my skin the longer I touched them. Family isn't defined by how it begins. It's defined by how it is lived. It was simple. It was everything. Earlier that day, when I had stood in front of all those people speaking words I hadn't even rehearsed, I hadn't realized how much of my past I was shedding. Years of trying to be polite. Years of telling myself that if I worked hard enough, smiled wide enough, stayed quiet long enough, people would eventually accept me. But acceptance based on silence isn't real, and acceptance that vanishes the moment you step out of line isn't love. That night, as the city lights blinked outside the window and the baby monitor softly crackled with the sounds of my daughter's breathing, I made a decision. I would no longer chase approval. I would no longer shrink to fit into rooms too small for the love I carried. I was a mother, not because of biology or paperwork or anyone else's permission, because of the way my heart split open the first time I held my daughter, because of the promises I made in the quiet hours when no one was watching, because of the way I would show up for her. Today, tomorrow, and every day after that. The days that followed the baby's shower were strange. There were texts from relatives, vague apologies wrapped in awkward wording. There were flowers delivered to our door, unsigned but easy enough to trace. Even Lena sent a message, short, defensive, hollow. I didn't respond. Forgiveness is powerful, but forgiveness isn't always reconciliation. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do, for yourself, for your family, is to leave the door closed. Chris understood without asking. We spent those days focusing on the life we were building, choosing a color for the nursery, arguing playfully over the best stroller, reading baby books out loud and laughing at how little we knew. Every time I looked at our daughter, I was reminded, this is what matters. Not the judgment of people too small to understand love, not the noise of those who only see worth in the ways they themselves have been loved. Family isn't what you're born into. Family is who shows up for you day after day without conditions. I would teach my daughter that. I would teach her that love is not measured by genetics or appearances. It's measured by who holds your hand when you're scared, by who fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, by who looks at you, fully, deeply, without expectation, and says, "You are mine, and I am yours." One afternoon, about a week after the shower, I took out a fresh journal and wrote my daughter a letter. Not because she would understand it now, but because someday she would. "My darling girl," I wrote, "you didn't grow under my heart. You grew in it. Every dream I ever had, every wish I ever made, was for you. You are my daughter, not because the law says so, but because my soul says so. You are loved beyond measure. Always have been. Always will be." I sealed the letter and tucked it away into a special box, along with Judge Burke's note and a copy of our finalized adoption papers. Someday, when she was old enough, I would show her, not to prove anything, but to remind her of the truth. She was wanted. She was chosen. She was loved with a love fierce enough to weather anything. As I slipped the box back onto the closet shelf, I realized something. The people who had laughed at me that day, they were already forgotten. But the love I fought for, The family we built, the life we were creating, that would echo for generations. Because when you fight for love, you don't just change your own story. You change every story that comes after you. And that is a legacy stronger than any bloodline.